Hello everybody, welcome back to Screenstars. I'm here today to bring you my review for the 1990 Steven Seagal action classic Hard to Kill. The film is directed by Bruce Malmuth and it of course stars Steven Seagal as Mason Storm along with Kelly LeBrock and William Sadler. Now the film focuses on Seagal's character Mason Storm, who is a police detective and he is doing some surveillance on a suspect. This suspect turns out to be William Sadler's character, who is a senator, Senator Vernon Trent, a very powerful and influential man. And once it is discovered that Steven Seagal has been recording him doing criminal activities, he uses his connections, his corrupt connections within the police force to put a hit out on Steven Seagal. He is then, so they think, killed along with his family, but in actual fact he survives, Steven Seagal, and is then in a 7-year coma. 7 years later he awakes to discover his family gone, and he vows revenge. Right, what are my thoughts on Hard to Kill? Well, as I said recently when I reviewed The Glimmer Man recently on this channel, I think far too many people on YouTube, in particular, focus on the negatives of Steven Seagal, and don't get me wrong, there are plenty. I'm not here to defend Steven Seagal. He's made some abysmal movies over the last 10 to 15 years. But before I started maybe revisiting some of those films that some would class as, abominations, because they are really quite hard to sit through, some of them, I thought I would revisit what I think are some Steven Seagal classics, because a lot of people conveniently forget that at the time, in the late 80s and the 90s and into the early 2000s arguably, he was a powerful figure in the action movie industry, and he was an influential figure, and he made some pretty good movies, and I think Hard to Kill is certainly up there. This is a film that I watched countless times on VHS back in the day. I remember back in the day, there was a few magazines that I used to subscribe to back in the day in the 90s. One of them in particular, I used to get Empire and Total Film and all that kind of stuff, and the usual computer magazines. But I also got a magazine, and I believe it was called Impact, and it was like an action movie magazine. And that's how I first discovered Seagal. And I think like the first half a dozen films of Seagal's were just really, really great action films for their time. And I just thought the action in them was spectacular. And I've always been a fan of this film. Now, watching it now, a bit older and a bit more mature, you can certainly see the weaknesses of this film. But it is still highly entertaining stuff. I think the premise here is solid. You know what I mean? A dedicated detective's family is murdered. He is seemingly killed, but is in a coma for a number of years and comes out for revenge. That in itself, you write that on paper, that's easy to sell, especially in the 90s or the late 80s. That was an action movie right there. And he was red hot at the time, Steven Seagal. And it just made for a really good premise. I think the setup of this film was excellent. The bit where his family's brutally murdered and stuff was all very impactful, and then the stuff with us in the hospital, other than a couple of cringy scenes with his then wife Kelly LeBrock, admiring his manhood under the sheets and stuff like that. Really, really cringy stuff. I thought the setup's excellent here, and then once he kind of gets out of the hospital and he goes to kind of recover at this ranch sort of thing, for me, it drastically dips for a while when we see probably some of the worst training sequences ever put to film of Seagal doing his now infamous girly run and doing some exercise and things like that. It's just terrible stuff. Rocky, it is not. And then when he's discovered again at the ranch, it picks up, and it picks up big time, and it never really draws breath again, and it never comes up for air, and it's fast-paced action from that point on, with a little twist. And if you've never seen the film, I don't want to spoil what that is, but there's a little bit of a twist, and then it is highly satisfying watching Seagal take his vengeance out on those that wronged him all them years previously. So it's, I mean, I'm not here to say it's an action classic. I wouldn't go that far. But for a Seagal film, it's practically a masterpiece when you compare it to some of the films he's been making in the last decade or so. Yeah, and at the time he was in shape. This was the first film where you saw his now famous ponytail. And it was just a nicely made film, bizarrely though, even though they were married at the time, and we know it was doomed to failure, his marriage to Kelly LeBrock, but the chemistry between them two on screen was non-existent, and to say they were a married couple at the time is bizarre, I suppose, but I suppose it was no surprise that they separated. And the cringy love scene, even though thankfully it doesn't show a lot, is terrible. We didn't need that. So there's things in this film that don't work, but when you actually consider the fast-paced action, the great premise, and it's a perfect vehicle for Seagal, and you get to see him absolutely kicking ass, and some brutal fight scenes. I think the unedited version of this is really brutal. I remember the version that I used to watch on VHS was probably fairly heavily edited, because I've got it now, and when you watch it again, there's scenes in it that I never used to see as a child, so you can now watch like a much more violent version of this. Unfortunately, and certainly in the UK anyway, a lot of Seagal's films in the 80s and 90s were fairly heavily edited in the UK, which is, they were still good to watch for me when I was a kid sort of thing, in my late teens, early 20s, but it was much later until I got to see like the full uncensored version. So for me, I think Steven Seagal for Hard to Kill, I think it's a good film in his filmography. It's well made. It's cheesy as hell at times. It's a film of its time in many regards, but it's highly entertaining stuff. And again, as I said last time, it's a reminder, I think, that Steven Seagal could make good movies. Unfortunately, that day is long gone. But thanks very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this review. I'll be back with more content on the channel very, very soon.